Oysters have an ancient history in the waters of Chesapeake Bay. But due to overharvesting, pollution, and disease, more than 99% of the historic native oyster population has disappeared. The state of Maryland has committed to a restoration plan looking to rebuild oyster colonies in 5 tributaries on its side of the bay. Skyler Henry met up with the team leading that effort along Maryland's eastern shore.
As the sun rises over the Little Choptank River, there's a crew hard at work, responding to a crisis underwater that's been unfolding for centuries. The declining population of the native Chesapeake Bay oyster. Inside each of these 3,000-gallon tanks are millions of future oysters. The work done by nonprofit the Oyster Recovery Partnership.
The work that we're doing is all in Maryland at this point, working in tributaries within the bay to restore those oyster reefs.
Leading the restoration effort, Executive Director Ward Slacum.
Oysters are important to the cultural heritage of Maryland. For one, oysters, as being the keystone species, it means that they're really critical to not just the ecosystem of the bay, but all the other animals that reside in the bay. But the harvest of those oysters also contributes to the economy.
Maryland's seafood industry is responsible for bringing in nearly $600 million annually.
Hi, may I help you?
Businesses like Fadley Seafood in Baltimore, Maryland, are directly dependent on the bay's overall well-being.
Well, without the oysters, we don't have anything. We need that oyster to siphon and clean the water in the Chesapeake Bay.
Damie Hahn is the 4th generation running Fadley's.
100 years ago, our oyster population could do it in 24 hours. Our current oyster population takes nearly a year to do that same job that it could do in 24 hours. We can't do what we do in providing fresh local without fresh local. So the health of the Chesapeake Bay is key to our success. It's key to our future.
The Fadley family has owned and operated the market for more than 130 years.
Through the 1800s, early 1900s, the oyster industry was really what defined Baltimore. A lot of areas would backfill with oyster shells. They used crushed oyster shells. So we were using the shells, not realizing that they needed to go back into the bay.
It wasn't until the 1950s when scientists discovered the link to the bay's declining health.
We were depleting our supply, and that these oysters needed old oyster shells in order to grow new baby oysters, the spat.
But with the shells shucked and the oysters dressed,
We'll have a cocktail and a little squeeze of lemon.
there was no easy way to get the used shells back into the water.
Cheers. Cheers. Here you go.
That's so
fantastic.
good.
They are so good.
That's so good.
They're so good. Now we have to recycle these shells.
Fadley's is one of about 400 area seafood restaurants, markets, and public job sites that has been recycling their shells through the Oyster Recovery Partnership. ORP crews pick up the shells and bring them to the University of Maryland's Horn Point laboratory to be processed over the next year.
When we get the dirty shells, they're aged, they're clean, and then they're loaded into the containers and then placed into the tanks ready for us to start putting mature larvae in it.
Stephanie Alexander is the laboratory's hatchery manager.
They filter the water, they create habitat, they are also spawning and adding to the population. And they're also helping with shoreline stabilization as well as nutrient sequestration. So overall, they're extremely valuable. They're the little kidneys of the bay.
But these vital organs of the Chesapeake need some assistance to repopulate at the rate needed to keep the bay clean.
So what we have here is what?
We have a bunch of oysters that we don't know the sex of yet, getting ready to start their reproduction.
Around 25,000 adult oysters a year are rotated through these spawning tables.
They're filtering this water in, and they are tasting it to say, hey, somebody else is spawning, I need to start spawning in response. And it's a chain reaction because they have to spawn at the same time in order for fertilization to take place.
In about 2 weeks, the fertilized eggs will be mature enough to be drained from their indoor incubators and gathered for their next stage in life.
Right now, there's 5 million larvae in my hand.
The bundle of larvae will be set in one of the outdoor tanks that's filled with the recycled oyster shells. The goal? To get the larvae to attach to the shells, where they'll grow for life, a process known as spat on shell. After another week or so, they're loaded up onto a boat and released into the water.
And then when they're deployed, they go out there They're put in reefs, is that correct?
They're put on reefs, which is basically a hard substrate, but we don't want to put them in the mud because if you put oysters in the mud, they're going to sink and they're going to die, and then all of our efforts for nothing.
ORP says they've planted around 8.5 billion juvenile oysters back in the waters and have rehabbed reefs in 2 tributaries with 3 more to go, set to be completed by 2025.
There's a lot that goes into this funding-wise as well, right?
Absolutely. It's definitely a multi-million-dollar operation to restore oysters annually in Maryland. And there's a huge commitment from the state of Maryland to provide that funding. NOAA also provides funds, and so does the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
But man-made challenges are once again risking the oyster's survival.
Historically, overharvesting and disease issues were kind of the big driver of the decline of oysters. Now I think it's lack of suitable substrate, because as the land becomes developed, you have more runoff, and in that runoff you have more sediment, and that sediment is falling out and burying the oyster reefs. Shell is very limiting, so we need everything we can get. So there's little steps that everybody can get involved in. You can eat oysters, you can support oyster aquaculture farms, and just make it a big circle of oyster love.
For CBS This Morning Saturday, Skyler Henry, Cambridge, Maryland.
A big circle of oyster love and the little kidneys of the bay. I had no idea how important.
Yeah,
What an
well, it
amazing
just goes
story.
to show you how sustainability, it should be a part of our practice as human beings, and yet we thwart it in so many ways.
Take care of the oysters, they take care of the ocean, they take care of our bellies.
Yeah.
That
Right?
too, right.
I mean, it all works together if you're doing it the right way.
Really, really great insight and great program.